It's like being frozen, isn't it? We're just till somebody comes on and will they see all four of us? How will it work, Pallavi? Oh, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Whatever.
Sorry, Roger. What?
It's okay. I was just wondering if you show all four of us, or how does it work? But will they see all four of us? How will it work, Pallavi?
It will show the four of us, and then when you start talking, I will be pinning you so that it's just you and the slides that are on the screen.
But for the intro, is it me and then I personally, and then I pass it over to Vibhuti,
yes.
and
yes.
then I say, and then Vibhuti says, or we say, okay, Pallavi, we can start the song.
Yes.
And then you start with the playing modernism, or you can put playing modernism while I'm speaking, if you like.
Yes, I'll put that while you're speaking.
Just hold it rather than we hold our faces.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay, is that okay, Vibhuti?
So I'm going to start it now. Here goes.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our inaugural lecture in the Mindful Modernisms webinar series. My name is Kurt Esperson Peters, and I'm going to be introducing the webinar series and the webinar session today. So these 8 webinars form a series of cross-cultural and interdisciplinary discussions organized by Academic Initiatives, which is a collaboration between the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitat, Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin College, and the Department of Interior Design at the University of Manitoba for the promotion of critical, mindful, and contemplative approaches in design thinking, education, and practice. For the Mindful Modernism series, the discussions are centered on mindfulness as a mode of inquiry to challenge assumptions about modernism and the lingering search for modern forms that remain embedded and often invisible in our social, cultural, political, and economic structures. We are especially interested in the intersection between mindful modernism and modern mindfulness in our built and designed environments in terms of design thinking, education, and practice. The structure of this series is centered around the following questions. What are the assumptions and inheritance of modernism in our present context? Are these modern narratives still at play in our thinking, practice, and pedagogy? What does being modern suggest today? Can the application of mindful and contemplative approaches restructure design thinking, education, and practice to embrace unprivileged, marginalized, and excluded viewpoints? Mindful Modernisms will consist of 8 webinar sessions, each with 2 distinguished speakers in dialogue around modern and mindful themes. The speakers come to these sessions from a range of design and non-design backgrounds, including interior design, architecture, mindful and contemplative studies, art and design history, graphic design and representation, gender studies, psychology, and sociology. The goal is to remove the speakers from their normal disciplinary and professional comfort zones, and through discussion and dialogue, have them bring their insights and intellect to bear on generating new ideas and possibilities about modernism and mindfulness in the allied and non-allied fields of design and the built environment. We anticipate these sessions to be dynamic, generative, and informative, both for the speakers and the viewers. The series is supported by the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada and Interior Designers of Canada, and partially funded by the Ontario Association of Architects and a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. We also want to thank each of our generous presenters for their time and effort in making this series happen, as well as our numerous students and research assistants and volunteers, Megan Pallenthor, Ali Zamani, and Cameron Collins, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. And of course, to all of you for showing up this early morning with your cup of coffee and bowl of cornflakes, looking for a bit of intellectual stimulation. The series is co-curated by Pallavi Swaranjali, myself, and Roger Connah. Mindful Modernisms is part of an ongoing series of webinars, publications, studio and seminar courses, and exhibitions organized by academic initiatives and the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats on the investigation of critical mindfulness in design thinking, education, and practice. For more information on our project or how to get involved, please contact us, and we'll be placing the contact information in the chat window. For today's session description, I'm going to hand this over to Pallavi now. Pallavi?
Thank you, Kurt. Just unsharing the screen because I can't see everyone otherwise. But hello, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Kurt. Thank you, everyone who has made this series possible. Welcome to the audience. My name is Pallavi Swaranjali, and I'm one of the curators for the series. I'd like to welcome Roger and Vibhuti. It is good to be back to continue the conversation that we started in our last webinar series that was titled Mindful Conversations, Design and Culture, and co-produced by the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats and Algonquin College earlier this year. So I wanted everyone to know that Vibhuti and Roger had ended that series in a webinar titled Celebrating Disruption. The idea of mindful modernisms, which is the present series, was born there in our conversations. It is indeed right then to have Roger and Vibhuti start this series and set the tone and theme for the conversations that are coming. So the format of this series, like the last one and what Kurt explained, will be a series of conversations. Kurt, Roger, and I have had great fun curating the series, more so especially in the pairing of the speakers, who, as you will notice, are from diverse disciplines and geographical locations. And the aim was to have the cross-cultural and interdisciplinary dialogue between the speakers, and as Kurt rightly said, challenging them to step out of their comfort zones and their frame of thinking to reevaluate and possibly disrupt established ways of thinking. So with Roger and Vibhuti here, we went a step ahead with this format of conversation. Vibhuti and Roger each sent me their slides separately after they decided 20 headings that they would be working with under the broad theme of the webinar. I then compiled the slides, alternating each of their slides with each other, much like a play of cards. Now, each slide will present ideas from the speaker's individual deck of cards in a blind juxtaposition with each other. Hence, the webinar is titled Mindfully Playing Modernism, a field of evidence. So they're playing their cards, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation. I will introduce Roger and Vibhuti briefly for those of you who are attending their webinars for the first time. It's a very difficult task to introduce both of their works in such a short time, but I'll try. You can read more about them on our website as well. Roger William Connah lives in Ruthin, North Wales, UK. He was Associate Professor, Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism, Carleton University in Ottawa, a visiting professor at the School of Art and Design in Guangdong University of Technology in China, and international chair at Sushant School of Art and Architecture, Gurgaon in India. Responsible for a series of publications, exhibitions, films that were carried out over 4 decades in Finland, Sweden, India, Pakistan, Italy, USA, UK, and Canada. Roger has published over 20 books on architecture, art, material culture, cinema, and society, including Writing Architecture, Being an Architect, Ian Ritchie, Finland, Modern Architecture in History, How Architecture Got Its Hump, Welcome to the Hotel Architecture, and Architectures of Thought, to name just a few amongst the many that he has written. He's also co-curator for this series, as well as the director and curator for conversations and publications for the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats. Dr. Vibhuti Sachdev is Dean at SSAA and Director, Architecture, Planning and Design Schools at Sushant University, Gurgaon, India. She qualified as an architect from SPA, the School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi, completed her PhD in 1996 from University of London, and has worked as a conservation consultant, writer, and designer. She has taught at the University of Sussex and written 4 books and several articles on the subjects of Jaipur, traditional knowledge systems, Indian cities, and Indian modernities. Dr. Sachdev has been a consultant on the restoration of the Jal Mahal in Jaipur and was the design curator for the artwork of its pavilions and the co-curator of the exhibition Painted Pleasures. Her latest book is on the festivals at the Jaipur Court. At Sushant University, she has introduced new programs, various reforms, and innovations in teaching and learning systems in the field of architecture, planning, and design at the undergraduate, postgraduate, and doctoral levels. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming Roger and Vibhuti. Roger, you are muted. So.
Are we supposed to have some virtual clapping there? Okay, I would like, can I begin now, Pallavi? Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
Roger, I'm just trying to see how I can share your screen while you talk.
Okay. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we're across the world in this situation. I would like to say a few words before Vibhuti and I start this exchange and this blind juxtaposition. And this will help you further the ideas of what we're talking about in terms of what is a conversation. We preface our presentation here with the term modernism. It is, according to some, an idea that won't go away, but it is to others an idea that they can't wait for it to dissolve. How has modernism got to this situation? Modernism, especially that which hangs on in architecture and design schools, surely reminds us of Nietzsche's words. When we are tired, we are attracted by ideas we conquered long ago. So our question, was modernism conquered before we even realized it became modernism? How should we define and tempt conversations that wish to insert a goodness into our visions? Conversations that wish the good in our design. What, for example, differs being mindful from being cognizant of, aware of, alert to? What if we add the prefix critical to these words? To be critically aware, to be critically alert. Is that being mindful? What if we added another prefix, to be self-critically aware, to be self-critically alert? What would our conversations become? Could they change our lives? It's good to talk. So ran a British telecom advert in the late 20th century. Little did we know how text might replace this activity for many people. The writer and historian Theodore Zeldin wrote a book called Conversation in 1998. He referred to this advert on a series of radio talks. How talk can change your life, ran his thesis. The problem was, he spoke and edited brilliantly. He framed what he thought a new conversation was all about. But he left something out, which has become increasingly important. The unknowing, or more topical at the moment, the unlearning. At times, he forgot to have that essential dialogue with himself, helping us to understand how he edited just what he edited from all the generalizations about conversation and dialogue in the world. What sort of conversation was Zeldin promoting that could change our lives? Conversation is, among other things, he said, a mind-reading game, a puzzle. We consciously and constantly have to guess why others say what they do. We can never be sure when words will dance with each other, opinions caress, imaginations undress, and topics open. But we can become more agile if we wish. It is this agility we are trying to talk about today. Approach. You can see where we're going. Certainly, to put it together like this, play architecture, mindful modernism, it's a minefield. But it is a minefield we will try to explore in this first webinar by returning to a moment in 1986 in India, in New Delhi to be precise, to an international competition for the Indira Gandhi Center for Arts, and the Jaipur court in 17th, 18th century India. We will begin to look into this. I would just like Vibhuti, Dr. Sachdev, to say a few words, and then I'll start we'll start our exchange.
Do you want to reveal the method, how Peter's book fits in? And
yes, I was going to do that.
Okay.
Okay. If, while Vibhuti, while we have this cross conversation, the idea for this exchange came when I was aware that we would do this. That we had the knowledge, we both had knowledge of these two particular eras, and we wanted to call it a field of evidence. And we say that because it's in this evidence that we start opening certain discussions. But at the same time, to put this in context, Peter Schreiber and Amit Srivastava's book, Modern Architecture in History in India, seemed a perfect way to try and locate these ideas. And so I read the chapter that was particularly on the era in Indian architecture around 1986, which Peter and Amit wrote about. And I took, as I read that chapter, I took various sentences which I thought were very interesting in terms of how a critic today, remember, this book is written in 2015. It's talking about 1986, but we're trying to take it back much earlier. And so we have identified 20 statements which are critically framing the sort of aspirations that maybe Indian architecture was looking at the time, remembering who is writing these and who is framing them. So you'll see in each slide, in each card played, has this sentence. And then we put our information to run together so we see how this works as a kind of double act. I think Dr. Sachdev would like to say something, and then...
Yeah, thank you. Just a few additions to that. My material is mostly Jaipur, but also culled out of the living traditions that sit alongside modernism today. But primarily I'll be focusing on 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries, in a way to kind of highlight the mindlessness of modernism, which is blind to dates, blind to context even, and with a special interest in how the vocabulary of modernism can indeed be stretched across centuries. That's we can start
Great.
with your card.
Thank you, Vibhuti. I would like to just say a moment. Now, when I introduced this IGNCA competition, there are various players involved in this, and it was really like a card game. So what you see on the left is the dossier that every competitor received. It's very detailed. It describes, it's a playbook, but it describes many things of what they were seeing expecting in Indian architecture at the time. The reason why I want to put it in context with you, because really it was the time when India was moving towards searching for something in terms of its own identity or its Indianness, whatever word is used in this. And it comes out of the line of course, Indira Gandhi as the Prime Minister, and then two other supporters of her, which were very strong in the arts, Pupul Jaka and Kapila Vatsyayan. And these were players in this competition, along with B.V. Doshi, A.P. Kanvinde, and Ranjit Sabiki. Now, some of you won't know these names, but the important thing is these are players in a whole context that was going on at the time. And you'll see why the other players come in when I talk about who was on the jury of the competition and what this competition aimed for. So I'm going to ask Pallavi, the next card, please.
Okay, so is that my first card? Was that your first card, Roger? The last one.
No, my Luchans, it should be in there, but it doesn't matter. I think it's the next one, isn't it?
Okay, so my card goes first and yours. I
don't know what, Pallavi?
I think Roger's goes first.
Okay, I have put it the other way. Your goes first and then Roger.
Okay.
There's Luchans. Okay.
Doesn't matter. Okay, so the caption that was given to me was climatically and culturally tempered vein of modernist architecture. And I want to represent this caption by a picture of Hawa Mahal, which can be translated as Palace of Winds. As you can see, it is both quirky and iconic, a thread that modernism too plays out very well in many of its buildings. My player is Pratap Singh, who reigned between 1778 and 1803. This to date stands almost as an emblem of Jaipur. It is Hawa Mahal because it sucks in the air, but to me, it is more of sort of a building that is about looking out because of the jharokas that are these little gaping holes in this curtain wall structure. Your card.
Thank you. Edwin Luchans, 1986. Of course, he wasn't alive in 1986. I've started to talk about the players around this scene at the time. And the players will come in a bit later when we look at the winners of the competition. But I also have a bit player. As critics, we are bit players really in this type of thing. And the bit players in 1986, when this competition was announced and awarded, was William Curtis from London, Dan Cruikshank from London, both from the AD, and myself from India, which was a bit player in a way, from Architecture Plus Design. And in 1987, I published a long essay in that journal called "Please, Mr. Luchans, Hold My Pencil." And it begins like this. Edwin sat down in his library. Around him, in the latest Rizzoli Bonanza issues of Architecture, of Michael Graves' drawings, Aldo Rossi, Rob Creer, Leon Creer, Ricardo Bofill, Portoghese, and Richard Mayer, all books in which Edwin saw some resonance to his own work. But now it was their turn, he said, because after all, he had died, and they had defined the recognizable idioms of architecture for the end of the 20th century. Edwin paused. Another Indian architecture in the making, he thought. Edwin returned the 0.5mm Pentel pencil to Ralph. Ralph will be another player in a minute, called Ralph Lerner. Edwin returned the 0.5mm Pentel pencil to Ralph. There, Ralph, now you do it yourself. You know more about the past now than I ever did, and more about the present than I ever could. Good luck. That was the way this opens. There is Luchans on the left, and there is an image and a page from the playbook, which was given out by the IGNCA promoting board. It went into much more detail, but you can guess the idea of the vocabulary and what was going on in the talk. Your card.
The agony of architectural professionals as problem solvers. This is a working map, an 18th century working map, a drawing on which the city of Jaipur was being planned. The site is plain, surrounded by hills. And the idea was how to settle a city abutting the hills and using the hills as a defense protection mechanism. Also, this was a city that was a commercial city. How to place a city that would become the best place to shop in and continues to be so. So there were all these problem-solving ideas that in a way used the traditional ideal vocabulary and put it on the site. So this is an 18th century working plan of Jaipur. Your card, Roger.
I'm going to read something. Innovating detailing using Buddhist, Hindu, and Islamic elements abound in these buildings. Aware of the fact that local laborers had to be employed in the actual construction process using materials and techniques familiar to them, the designer adopted a vocabulary that was familiar to them. The careful blending of alien elements expressed in red and pink sandstone has resulted in a unique style that at once has the gravity of European classicism and the humane charm of indigenous architecture. Does it really matter who wrote that? On the left, you will see a Luchans building, and it's in the playbook that was given to the architects. On the right, you will see the first prize awarded to the architect from Princeton, Ralph Lerner. Your card.
This is a plan of Jawahar Kala Kendra designed by Charles Correa in 1986, so very exactly close to what Roger is describing as a time period. This uses the map that we saw, the idea of Jaipur that we saw in a working drawing, and uses the idea of the 9 square as the mandala to design this art institution, shifts 1 square in a way to invoke the plan of Jaipur. Apart from the mandala and as one of its key concepts. Korea uses Alvarado, Madeira, whereas other influences that almost have become kind of an autobiographical work, a collection of all the influences that he went through during his career. It is almost to suggest that this building will be experienced in plan. Indeed, when you go enter the building, you're not aware of the influences, but in plan. And so one wonders what happened to the mandala and the various influences. The degenerative tendencies of postmodernism is what it is. Your card.
You will see at the very beginning, I opened with a series of cards which were called Play Architecture, which is actually a courtesy of a student of mine who published them in 1989. These attractive little drawings. Vibhuti's right. The time 1986 was a strange pivot. There were many of these architects could almost be holding Luchans' pencil. But the issue here, and I want to read out what the jury said and what the position gave. And this is where I bring in five new players now. And the new players would be the people who are on the jury, who decided this was a type of idiom that was acceptable for the promotion of an Indian architecture in 1986. The lead juror was James Sterling. The second was Fumihiko Maki from Japan. The reserve UIA member was Olifemu Majekonduni, with B.V. Doshi and A.P. Kanvinde also down as being part of the jury. You will see why the choice of the jury is important as we move on. And you will see also little drawings that I put at the top. I will go through these as different types of drawings, but to the jury, it was significant, Lerner's project, because there was no attempt to hide the source of one's architecture, nor the formality of its response to that architecture. The formality of this response, very much in a postmodern way, was a drawn formality, which Vibhuti has talked about. And even now, when you look at these cards, you can see the drawn seduction, or the way they're seductive is very much in the way they're drawn, and where they're almost, without being too curt, almost diagrammatic, and the diagrammatic gets transferred into the plan or the model. Degenerative tendencies of postmodernism. That is the Heart series in the Play Architecture set of cards, which is the postmodernism series. It includes card number 5 of Hearts, which I want to bring attention to because I will return to it later. It is the gallery in Stuttgart by James Sterling. Okay, your deal.
The woozy face emoji means that you had a few too many or many too many. It can also mean that the user is tired, overly emotional, or plain confused. Or according to popular meme, it represents dumb-faced men make when they try to look too sexy in a photo. This is the best I could do with the word decent. Human structure in a rapidly urbanizing world. Both these words, decency and the rapidity of urbanization, are I could not find in the worldviews of 18th, 19th, early 20th century architects. Your cut.
I'm going into a little more detail now, and this is just to make to credit Peter Scriver and Amit Srivastava for their work. It is an incredible, and I do recommend it to anyone. It's a timely study on India. But one of the things that struck me was how we use the language at certain times in our, let's say, critical lives, and how that language can hold at some moments, and then at some moments that language just drifts away, or you know, like a bird, it hits the glass that it doesn't see in front of it and falls. Decent human structure in a rapidly urbanizing world. Like Vibhuti, I haven't a clue what a decent human structure is. But presumably at that time, a jury seeing these sorts of models of the buildings that were proposed by Ralph Lerner, this was the first prize, one would say that they felt this was on the way to becoming a decent human structure. I show it this way because it is very hard to put the two things together and to say what would have become of this building. But you'll see how this develops as we move on. Your card.
Jaipur was built in the context of a waning Mughal power. Aurangzeb was on the throne, who was not very ambitious in expanding his territory. Jai Singh came to power, and in a way, as is the trend, that the young power invokes the outgoing architectural vocabulary. Jai Singh chose to build his new city in a material that was cheap but very effective. What you see is what looks like red sandstone with marble inlay work, and it continues to fool everyone today because it is not red sandstone, it is rubble masonry with lime plaster, with white lime lines mimicking a much more expensive material. And also what it meant, this meant that he could build it very, very fast, because it didn't mean getting slabs of stone and dressing it. It was put together very, very rapidly. So it was a pragmatic response to limited resources. Your cut.
This I'm going to put in terms of moving on to, you saw how the Ralph Lerner project, and we will come back to it also, but how it really, it formally echoed the central vista in Delhi, and also formally echoed the way that Luchans had set up his spaces, and indeed the playbook that was given to the competitors almost indicated that Luchans was the kind of the grandfather of what could become. But of course, other architects didn't take this, and I'm going to go through some of the work as they change, and what then we can come to some sort of understanding of what was happening at that pivot, and did it really signify a change? Was architecture as diagrammatic as it did become in that time? And would other projects have been able to make a difference or not? So the first prize went to Ralph Lerner, and the second prize went to an Indian architect. On the right, you'll see the model, Gautam Bhatia. And I have to say, when I was looking at all this material, it started to become very interesting when I looked at the way the competition had given out the portfolio of the 5 winners. And I noticed that Ralph Lerner's work was way more polished than anyone else's work. Clearly, this office, however, whatever size it was, had enough money to do this. For many Indian architects, they would have been stretched to the limit to do the type of requirements that the jury asked of them. So it's to some great merit that an architect, a young unknown architect at the time, Bhatia, actually managed his model to be out of card to be look as good as it did, because the jury or the competition required balsa wood model and really refined model, and you could see previously with the Luchans model, it's really very, very detailed. So what happens as you see, we're not privy to the other 140 entries, but the quality of the models in the next 4 prizes, the jury gave 1 prize, 1 first prize, 1 second prize, and 3 joint third prizes. The level of detail in the third prizes and the second prizes is in the drawings and the imagination, but not in the quality of the actual built product or the model that we were making. So there was some seductive aspect which postmodernism in a way played into, in a way it displayed its architecture. So you will see the Jeremy Dixon from London, and then Tom Basis from Greek. This sort of, yes, you can start seeing the modernist relationship, the formal relationship between outer space and inner space and building. It was, again, we've only got 5, but it was Bhatia who actually took the curve, took the level of the building, and started to develop a completely different morphology on the site. And I think I want to return as we go on to this morphology, because I think it'll come back in relation to Jaipur and what Vibhuti is talking about. The diagrammatic element against the morphological element, which was spatial, which Bhatia was trying to put forward. And I'll return to that as we go. Your next card.
Mindless imitation of architectural form and features of modern Western cities. This building was designed by Samuel Swinton Jacob, who was an engineer posted in Jaipur. And it was sort of a precursor to the Great Exhibition. This was built in 1883 to house some exhibits. And as you can see on the facade, it is with all its borrowings, the pediments and the almost mindlessly, those the pilasters and the decoration is indeed something that is representing modern Western cities, and therefore must have felt very modern at the time. So 1883, your card.
When this competition came out, of course, it was considered one of the biggest competitions, certainly in India, but internationally at the time. About 156 entries. And the jury only had, I think, maximum about 4 days, which, when you think about it, is not very much time to decide the merit of 150 plus architects. This is what P.K. Das said in the Times of India. Astonishingly, in the first 23 designs shortlisted by the jury, only one Indian entry, that of Gautam Bhatia figured. This implies that either the Indian architecture community is utterly inept, or it is the jury that has for some reason been swayed by designs which are, not surprisingly, quite un-Indian in their methods and inspiration. It is, in fact, the jury which has failed to meet the test. This is for two fundamental reasons. First, there has been an absence of any kind of coherent and unifying approach and philosophy in their judgment. There is also a profound contradiction between the philosophy and approach demanded from entrants in the competition program, which is profoundly Indian, and the actual final selections. So at the same time, we were getting a jury that had lauded Ralph Lerner's project for the first prize. Images you've seen, the model you've seen, the Luchans-esque approach you've seen. It was decrying the fact that that was so un-Indian, it's written by the Indian press, that was so un-Indian that it should also be disqualified from being given the first prize. So clearly we were on shaky ground here. One of the third prizes was the Flying Roofs, which was a French project. You could see that this type of project in the language that Madame Jorda had used was very much like, almost like an embassy-esque type of architecture, which you find in the privileged precincts. Certainly in Delhi, you'll find in Janakpuri. But at the same time, you get something like the bottom drawing from Jeremy Dixon, which was one of the few that actually had the drawings which were, it's not so much the drawings were unformed, but they had a certain incomplete edge to their completion. And this is a thing that one would see in European competitions at the time, that a first prize wouldn't necessarily be the one that is totally worked out, but it would be one with the most potential. Incidentally, in this case, Lerner's first prize was also one, as far as we can see, which was the most thoroughly worked out and the most thoroughly drawn. That will lead us on to certain things as we move on. Your card.
Losing local identity through uncertain borrowings. This building is the Rajasthan Legislative Assembly, constructed in 2001, designed by a committee. I'm assuming, because it doesn't name the architect, it's designed by the Rajasthan State Public Works Department. In its setting, it is very Luchans-esque, as we all know the plan of New Delhi and the Rashtrapati Bhavan. And also you can see how it is drowned with uncertainty. The iconic Luchans dome is awkward and embarrassing, and also has to house the four-lion Ashokan lions. Luchans dome is very iconic, and it has very clear references to Buddhist Sanchi stupa imagery. And here it has become very, very clumsy, because although the round of the dome is there, and then there is a sort of a lotus cap, and then, as if that is not enough, you also have to do the four lions. A very awkward, again, facade wraps this central atrium, and dotted with almost meaningless chhatris and lip service to Indian motifs. So indeed, all the borrowings are shrouded in uncertainty. Your card.
Now, interesting that Vibhuti used the phrase lip service to Indian motifs. We just heard that one of the press, and there was a lot of press at the time. It became a scandal in many ways, which I'll explain to as we move on. But Lerner and the office, or Lerner, was probably the only one who actually engaged with the playbook that had been given to the architect with answering in the same way. Very few of the architects either did that, the other competitors, or didn't have the time to do that. But these are sentences from the Lerner report. Every architect had to write a report of over 20 sides. I mean, even the task of asking for a report from an architect was kind of really off-putting. Quote, "We have maintained a preference for simple geometries and geometric relationships, typical of Hindu, Mughal, and classical traditions." That's quite a generalization. Quote, "The architecture reiterates the roles of the center, whose purpose is to encompass all arts across boundaries of time, regional, and social grouping." That's also a huge generalization and exaggeration. Third, quote, "Even though the New Delhi plan was alien in spirit to indigenous planning practices at the time, Luchans attempted an interesting mixture of architectural styles blending Indian and European vocabularies." I suppose the question for us critically would be, when did lip service become defined as lip service? And what could we mean by it? The drawings on the left is the classic Indian motif, the borrowed drawing that Luchans is, Freudian slip, Lerner is drawing as if he's holding Luchans' pencil, and you can see it could be the turn of the century, it could be 1900. It doesn't matter what year that is, and even to the figure draped, the man draped by the two women in the front. This is all a little bit uncomfortable, yet it obviously wasn't uncomfortable at the time. I put this against the sort of drawing that Dixon attempted, Jeremy Dixon from UK, by putting, a bad Xerox copy of something in the past, and then trying to show that something meant, okay, he was making an attempt. It was a sketch that we would see in a notebook, but he was, as far as I can see from the documents that I was privy to, he was the only one who actually entered the competition with a series, as I've said before, of rough drawings, which suggested that the building could be shaped further if it went ahead or if it got an award. So uncertain borrowings is an interesting one. At the time, someone like Peter Schreiber and Srivastava in the book in 2015 can look back on this period and talk about uncertain borrowings. At the same time, at that time, these were considered, this was the major factor why Ralph Lerner won first prize. Your card.
Dominant received theories and models of modernization. Early 20th century brought the possibility of travel, and as all of you know, that within an Orthodox Hindu court, crossing the seas and oceans was a taboo. Indeed, one could lose one's job as a king if one dared to do that. Madhu Singh, who reigned between 1880 and 1922, took this as an opportunity to generate a narrative that would convince his people in Jaipur that he was merely following Govind Dev, whom he took with him to England in the ship called SS Olympia. And he very carefully followed all the rituals. And I've written extensively about this. If anyone's interested in reading it, he followed the rituals of washing the ship in milk, having separate kitchens for the king, for the god, king, and the subjects. All the purifying rituals were followed very carefully, and he managed to cross the 7 seas unharmed and return. So a very, very modern move at the time. Yeah.
Dominant received theories and models of modernization. It's very interesting. Vibhuti's previous image would have fit nicely in Le Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture without the added narrative ever being played out as the celebration of steam and shipping became important in modernization and modernism in the early 20s. You may or may not know whose building this is on the left, but there's no secret, it is James Stirling. Can we say something about received theories and these models in a way that we can attach some diagrammatic element to these? Jaipur House that Vibhuti just explained would go fit very well with that cartoon image, diagrammatic image of architect arc heads. This was a series by a cartoonist out of London who used to publish in the RIBA Journal and did many architects. Again, around this time, it was interesting that the play architecture cards also was around this time, that somehow there was an element to there was a cartoon effect of some of these architects, and that was pre the stage when architects were starting to take the stage with and became known as starchitects in probably the mid 1990s, but it started towards the end of the 1980s and into the early 1990s. Stirling was one who affected a change, and the change came in the way his work, in a way, he had developed dominant received theories of an earlier modernism. Anyone going back to Stirling's Cambridge Library or the Leicester University building will see a very different a technological modernism, which he was really prided for. And then suddenly Stirling, a bit, very much, I think you can put by Charles Correa, why Vibhuti showed that work of Charles Correa, and Charles Correa shifted from his very the dominant received theories of modernism that he did in the Indira Gandhi Airport in Delhi and in the Ahmedabad Hotel and many buildings where it was received theories, and they became models of modernization for India. At the same time, we have this head of the jury in India actually, and I think it's no exaggeration, being one of the main voices in this competition, given that Lerner was teaching in Princeton. I won't go into the conspiracy theories. There are a lot of conspiracy theories about this competition, and as there are on many competitions. But I want you to just pay attention to the layout. to Stirling's layout and the way the formal tropes that Stirling was doing, which echoed certainly with Lerner's work. And probably, again, the fact that Lerner's work was drawn so highly in a polished manner suggested a rapport with motifs in India, which I am not sure were really there. So in other words, there was a sort of copycat motif chasing going on, and the language that is used, you know, for example, and I'll finish with this for this one quotation from Lerner, quote, "As the Indian cultural heritage embraces a wealth of building conventions and types, so the center architecturally displays a number of traditions within the structure of its unified spatial strategy." That's almost tautologically saying that, well, we know that India has this wealth of building conventions and types, so I will give you a repetition of these because it's a structure to make it a unified spatial strategy. So it's kind of parenthetical thinking in design, which, you know, in a way you can't get out of. So it's dominant, it's received theories, it's not models of modernization, but it became models of modernization. So there's an interesting play of language in relation to what's happening in this competition. Your card.
This is the 9th card, and we have 11 more. Pallavi, and we are one into the game. This is, I think, late 19th and earlier 20th centuries was when modernism was felt most deeply, without it being worrying. And Jaipur by then, early 20th, had gained this global reputation of being a symbol for royalty. And this is the Jaipur perfume by Connah, and you can see it's a ring. It's a ring of a Maharaja, of course. It's all design, but it holds within it the promise of what the royal bracelet, or it says, would look like, feel like, and the whole mood of royalty, the purple color and the glass as well is frosted and very, very delicate. Non-Western architectural and design forms. Oh God.
Thank you. Maybe you have to go a bit quicker. Well, I'm speaking to myself. I want to step this up a bit now and see the intrigue. I talked about conspiracy, and I talked about, so you've seen the non-Western architectural and design forms. Okay, the Indian heritage and the motifs on Indian heritage would, we think, be non-Western in many ways, but the way the design form and the formality of them was in a classical Western way, and Luchans had perfected that melange, and it was undoubtedly Lerner who had perfected it in 1986 as well. I just want to talk about this project. This is Bhatia's project, because in a way, deconstruction was only just starting to come around at the time, and I'm not trying to put it into that context at all. But I want to make the difference between the formality of trying to pay lip service to Indian motifs that Vibhuti is starting to reveal in a very clear way. This lip service to those sort of, and the morphology that exists in some of Indian environments, previous planning, whether it's Jaipur or not, and one of the things that is important to this is Bhatia's surprise second he was surprised, of course, to get second prize as a young architect. But then he talked about, of course, in interviews, he's asked why and how. The important thing here is he did talk about the Ajanta caves in India. And again, I don't want to go into much detail of that, but I just want to shift the fact that there was a clear morphological difference in the way Bhatia handled space and the way he was going to see the center in a progression in many ways in different courses. At the same time, being aware of some sort of Indian heritage, but he was not doing formal makeovers of an existing Hindu. So his work was a design morphological experiment compared to the formality of Ralph Lerner's work, which you could get from the playbook. And then the three other winners, which were more technological responses to a building as complex as a national center of arts. And you'll see that a little bit later. So it's quite interesting when we try and understand what are non-Western architectural design forms in a global world that is now, especially in that time in the 1980s, was playing with all these forms transnationally. Your card.
Regional and cultural specific approaches to modernity, and this is a leaf from a calendar. It's a bilingual calendar, and very much a reality with how time is mapped in Indian society. We continue to live in both Western and non-Western temporal paradigms, and it's almost kind of layered and at times difficult to comprehend the dates and the shifts, and so this is of course a Gregorian calendar with lunar calendar layering. Regional and cultural specific approaches. Your card.
Regional and cultural specific approaches to modernity. Interestingly, I put this in this position because I mentioned morphology in terms of Bhatia and the morphological experience in architecture, which might lead us to a sort of a different approach to expression, and then hence an expressionism. So there's a certain element of play and striving for a monumentality that is actually appropriate in the context, but is actually designed to fit in. And this is where I think the jury identified Bhatia's project as I mean, it could easily have been the first prize. There's no question about that. But it is interesting how Lerner's project became the first prize, which will take me on to a little bit of looking how the Indian press at the time then were heavily divided on this competition. Next card, your card.
Indianness of spatial practice in architectural art. This scene is very commonly seen regardless of what design or building is being built. This is the foundation laying ceremony where all the rituals are performed. Increasingly, the research in architecture, architectural history and architecture itself, there is a very remarkable shift from form and typology to process today. And indeed, if the process involves a ritual like this, I wonder what the narrative would be. Indianness has a very creepy way of getting into modern processes, and this is one of the examples in which it continues to survive, albeit invisibly. Your card.
That's very interesting, because that really resonates with the notion of citing and activities that can be cited in situations that don't particularly announce that they're going to happen, but like that ceremony before in what Vibhuti said, the formality, as you can see, of now that is the shot of the central vista in Delhi. The slightly blackened part is Bhatia's project. I think it's very hard to say that, you know, that this project had more Indianness about it than other, but the spatial art in it, and I wish we could see more of the other. I'm sure many of the other Indian architects, like Romy Khosla, had projects that were really very interesting in terms of spatial art and what Vibhuti has started to identify. But these were not allowed to come to the fore for various reasons we're identifying around the time in world architecture and the time where Western models, postmodernism was able to learn from non-Western models and actually recreate it and turn it back into. So we were in I remember being in a conference with in 1987, and Charles Correa was there, and I was talking about the carnivalesque in architecture, and Correa was actually adamant that no, this element of now taking the wow, and he used this term, the wow factor from Rajasthan or Gujarat was an adequate element within the design of Indian architecture. That's what many of the younger architects at the time, Bhatia was one of them, but there are very many others, were trying to reformulate what modernism could be for India after the time since the 1920s. Your card.
In sort of late 19th, early 20th century, Madhav Singh commissioned boxes of architectural drawings, which Swinton Jacob led this project. He drew Indian elements in boxes separated in terms of function. So there will be a box of doorway, box of chhaja, box of arches. And these were all boxes of loose leaf drawings, accurate drawings. And the purpose, he very clearly said, was to assist the architect and designer to mix and match various elements, pulling out elements from these boxes. This was a very radical experiment, and this is a building that was again supervised by Jacob, but designed by Chiman Lal, one of his disciples, whom he made to learn how to draw. And this is the process of how those boxes play out in this design. It's a completely mismatched mix and match approach of, it's an interesting slip, mix and match approach of various elements across Rajasthan. And it is a perfectly square building with, you know, a cross-shaped building. You know, all the facades are equal, but if you look closely, there is no adherence to region, context, proportioning system, and it is very, very European in plan. It's got a huge double-height space in the middle. This building was designed, was commissioned by Madhav Singh as a place where he could entertain the British and, you know, make them drink wine and eat meat. And this is situated just outside the city palace walls, so it does not, pollute the palace precinct. So radical in many ways, experiments with new regionalist approaches. Your card.
As I previously talked about, Bhatia's plan and a kind of offset cascading plan with spatial elements, you can see the formality that we return to in Lerner's project. But the question is emerging is that how the type of criticism or the critique that came after this had no chance to emerge during a competition process. And as I've read the statements by P.K. Das from Times of India, there was an uproar, and this goes on in P.K. Das's piece. The Institute of Architecture in India, has mentioned 10 reasons why the prize-winning entry should have been disqualified. This was the Indian Association of Architecture looking at the process and the work. So it had mentioned 10 reasons why this project should be disqualified. That begs the question is, why didn't anyone else notice this? Okay. Ranjit Sabiki, professional advisor, pointed out that the points raised are incorrect. Instead, he says, the jury was fully aware of the deviations made by Ralph Lerner. So not only is he claiming it's incorrect, but he's claiming that deviations by the architect Ralph Lerner on the plan, they recognized and knew too well, but hadn't revealed that when they gave the architect first prize. Hence the press, of course, highlighted that. The decision not to disqualify Lerner because there were minor deviations was not considered. We move on. Next slide.
When Madhu Singh went in that ship and crossed the ocean, one of the things he carried with him are these 12 water bottles, silver water bottles, or Gangajalis. These are usually very small in size, and pilgrims who go to Ganga, which is a sacred river, carry some of its water, bring it home to purify their house, and it's very useful to have kind of this purifying agent. This was the rhetoric of Indianness that he communicated to his subjects in Jaipur, that he was not polluting himself. He was only drinking Ganga water. There's no way to check what it contained, of course. I mean, it could, but this was clearly what rhetoric like this was clearly instrumental in making his trip abroad successful. Next, your card.
Now, just at this point also, we must stress that we're not, these are sentences that are from a chapter that was used around describing architecture and describing the modern narrative in India in a book that we've cited earlier. So we're not, in a way, we're not trying to overwhelm anyone with this language. We're just saying that this is the type of language that is around. It's a type of historic language, correct? Correct in some ways, but who's to say? So we are working in this language, many of us who are in academic world. And at the same time, we might be missing the rhetoric or the new rhetoric of Indianness, or we might not be able to identify it, just as I think James Sterling and Fumihiko Maki maybe didn't identify the remaining quality in the competition. But you can see This was a Sunday Review Times of India. Designs fair and unfair. The left-hand side, Lerner, and the right-hand side, Bhatia. Clearly, because an Indian project won second prize, they could make a little oppositional game to this. But coming back to this rhetoric, I wanted to just read a small piece. Remember, we are bit players. There was William Curtis at the time, Daniel Cruikshank, who both wrote about this work in the Architectural Review in UK in January 1987, and I wrote about it in the Indian Review. And this is what I said about Bhatia and the questions that we are circling now. Associative and illusory, Bhatia's iconic fluency, the Ghat symbolism, is not without a touch of humorous loans. But it's not so much a derivation as a healthy anxiety and participation within current architectural concerns. Is it an idiomatic transfer through symbolism to an Indianness? Of course, Bhatia's Indianness has a different maturity from Lerner's. Its deflection from strict Luchanesque vocabulary made just that difference in the size of the check he received. Your card.
'1850s revolutionized Europe, and indeed Jaipur, which was on a par with Europe in new ideas of image making. Photography was introduced, and it very much at the same time synchronously touched the Jaipur court. It revolutionized not only the way images were taken, the rapidity of it, the reproducibility of it, but also Ram Singh, the Maharaja, then used it as an opportunity to refashion how royalty would look like. And here he is on the left, seated with legs crossed on a chair, holding a stick, which almost looks as though he's holding a cigar in his hand, but he's not. And he's wearing specs, which is also something new for a king to wear, and not at all looking threateningly Maharaja-like. On the right, he is dressed or not as a devout Shaivite, seated on a floor performing a ritual in very, very plain, ordinary terms. So an image of India contemporaneously exotic. Managed to say that word.
I love that idea. What did you say? Threateningly, what did you? Threateningly Mughal.
Maharaja-like.
Maharaja-like. Well, how wonderful, threateningly Maharaja-like. What is this contemporaneously exotic? So the two projects, and clearly we could have gone into detail much more, but I'm going to one of the press, one of these that says, moreover, Lerner, his building has the artificial grandeur and monumentality of any colonial edifice built to establish and reflect the power and the glory of foreign rulers, and at the same time awe its imperial subject. Now, maybe that was allowed in 1986. There's no way that would be, we would be critiquing this in a different way. B, we would be looking at a competition with a completely different eyes, just in the space it's happened. So this dichotomy that came up in the press, in a way, it hasn't really been, let's say, adequately critiqued in terms of it was a shift in Indian architecture at the time, maybe by chance represented by a young architect who happens to win, but he's only representative now of many young architects that are still trying to do, if we prefer to use the word, still trying to do a mindful modernism or a mindful architecture, still trying to do it, and still often beset and besieged by Western models that they're seeing even their own clients now requesting. So as architecture has become much more of a social media thing, and it's spread, more people get a knowledge of it in terms of the image and the idea, the desire of an image. So again, we have this image. Perhaps we can put it a little bit simpler: an image versus space, an image versus the spatial aspect. These two projects, and the context of this, the West has rejected Corbusier, came out in one essay in the press, who had interviewed the Indian architect Satish Gujral. Now, anyone in India knows also that Satish Gujral comes with a lot of other critical knowledge or baggage or whatever we'd like to call it. So, but the important thing was that this was, he said, God forbid that the winner of this competition should be a noted architect and a foreigner. Then, like Chandigarh, there will be more copying for a whole generation of Indian architects. That's quite a damning statement. It's quite a damning statement, of course, on his own architects, but it's a damning statement on the whole process. But at the same time, there was still this battle with the younger architecture students and architects having to deal with the remnants of a modernism which was being changed. Of course, postmodernism was a time when it changed it. Many of you will probably know that, of course, Lerner's building never got built, and it didn't have a chance to be built. But that's a discussion of that for another day. Okay, that's next card.
Complex network of Indian craft traditions. This symbolizes that, and this is a lid of a box that says on it, "Made in Jaipur State." Now, when Jai Singh established the city, he invited the best craftsmen to settle in the city, gave them tax incentives, gave them land on a cheaper rate, with shared infrastructure. And once they were settled there for a few years, he told them that whatever you produce will only be sold in Jaipur. So this kind of very strategically and conscious strategy of building the brand results in this box that can proudly say "Made in Jaipur State." And there is a lot to learn from this brand building exercise, even for modern commercial economies. This we are talking about 18th century. Your call.
So let's go back. I think we're getting towards the end now. So I want to say something about the the assumptions that were made in this competition. And another of the press came out and said, are we to understand that the members of the jury were either not informed or did not bother to familiarize themselves with the conditions of the program before accepting their responsibility as judges of the most important competition of its kind in history? This is quite significant because, in a way, Lerner played the whole situation, played the game, played his cards extremely well, whether we agree with it or not, because the playbook that I said I have here, it's a huge playbook. It's very detailed. It divides it into 5 areas, sacred areas. It structures the whole symbolic, sacred way that this space could have been designed. It's quite possible that the jury members didn't read the whole thing. It's quite possible that many of the entrants into the competition didn't read it, because it's like a draft for a PhD outline. It's not a PhD, but it's a draft for an outline. And it actually gives all of clues of the type of architecture you could do if you were holding Edwin Luchans' pencil. And I think Lerner at the time coincided with a postmodern understanding of vocabulary and image, because there is no real talk about form or space in Lerner's project. It is taken for granted that formal design and formal processes and formal relationship to spaces, we take for granted what the spatial implication of them. Clearly, as I've described, Batias didn't do that. So it was in one way, I think we can see why a jury in 4 days would have to come to a decision. And this would appear streets ahead of the other projects, partly because of the rhetoric, the image content, and the way it had diagrammatically replied to the set of cards it was given in terms of the playbook, and it dealt the cards back. And I think in that way, you can see why this was given first prize. Next. Sorry, your deal.
Rationalities intermixed with folklore, craft, and mythology. When Savai Jai Singh set out to build the city, he was a Kshatriya ruler class, surrounded by the Brahmin class, who were the scholars and the timekeepers, so to speak, for the state. And he was constantly being, the Brahmins would have different schools and they would argue with each other about auspiciousness of time. His whole daily cycle, yearly cycle, as you know, would have been governed by these almanacs. And there was not just one almanac, there were several almanacs belonging to several schools. So what he did was, again, very, very radical, very modern, and very kind of, show me evidence-based rationality. He built what I call the Big Ben of Jaipur. This is a clock. This is a clock that maps the lunar time. This is Jantar Mantar. And he built this giant clock in concrete, not concrete, in brick and lime and mortar. And every time there would be an argument between the two Brahmins saying, no, it's not 10 past 5, actually it's 15 past 5, he would take them to the clock and say, show me the time. And this is Jantar Mantar, where you can read the constellations, you can read the lunar time, tithis, the days, the date, and the whole time structure. So this, for me, symbolizes that intermixing of folklore, craft, and mythology. Your card.
It's quite interesting. I can quite imagine what Vibhuti is just talked about there, that even a playbook could have used Janta Manta as a scenario within which architects could have reworked. Of course, it didn't use that. It used the central vista and the Luchans' existing use of mixed motifs. So you even get here where Dixon, in a third prize, has his small little circular buildings on the left. So you see there's some reading, a different reading to the same forms that they picked up. And it's very likely that even the three third prize winners, Francois Jourda, Tom Barsis, and Jeremy Dixon, I would be guessing, but probably not have been to India to check the site or in that way, because the playbook was so extensive that you could imagine all sorts of ways of developing it, and the photographs and the motifs which were given in the playbook. Your card.
Early 20th century saw Maharajas getting bored with their palaces with no electricity, no running water, no indoor swimming pool. So many of them commissioned and built new palaces in the, adjacent to their old ones. And this is a picture of an indoor swimming pool in Rambagh Palace. Very modern. Your card. Pallavi, there's a gray box that's hiding the cards. Thanks.
The gray box is very suitable for that. Those cards now. We're in the gray box. We're in the spades. I think we're turning this up now. I can see that our conversation could run and run, but I'm putting this on because the norms and assumptions of 20th century architectural modernism, where do we base those norms and assumptions? Do we base it on the architects and the architecture that we've already got, which is already heavily, say, westernized? Although now there are new series of narratives of modernism that are coming out in other countries, non-West countries, where we're showing the so-called imitation or the adaptiveness of certain projects. So where is our starting point, and where do we locate ourselves? And when we're in architecture school or design school, who do we refer to? Gropius, Mies, or Le Corbusier? Is it Jack, Queen, and King? It sounds trivial at times to say, well, it is played like a game. I've often talked with many architects, well-known ones and not so well-known ones, and it is quite interesting that many of them do say that to penetrate further, that you have to understand the gaming that goes on in professional architecture. And the gaming that goes on in professional architecture is nowhere better seen than in a competition like that in 1986. Next, Yoko.
Age-old deep structure of more explicit myths. This is Govind Dev with Radha, the most famous couple who presides over the city of Jaipur. Govind Dev was not always here. He was found in 1590, so in a way he belongs to the Mughal period in Vrindavan, and he was then housed in Govind Dev temple in Vrindavan, which was an Akbari temple. Moved from there in 1669 because of the threat of the temple being demolished, brought to Jaipur in 1714 and installed in the heart of the city, newly built city, in 1735. So he's had a life, quite a long life before, and quite a museum-worthy piece, but very much a part of explicit myth. Yoga.
I just, this is one of the last 2 or 3 cards now. The Ajanta caves I put on the left for a reason that it's not only significant in terms of space and it's UNESCO, obviously, but and also the fact that Bhatia kind of hinted at that. Sometimes we take it with a bit of pinch of salt when an architect hints at that, but I do think that there was an element of sensitivity in that project which might have turned into quite a significant building. Just bringing this around full circle and knowing that one of Luchans' building on the vista now, on the central vista, is now in ruins or becoming a museum and has to be changed. A lot of the work is being reclaimed. It's interesting now if the work is actually has to be refinished now as it was with Luchans, and whether had Lerner's project been, we would have another ruin of this type of kind of colonial hangover, which then would have become another melange. So in many ways, I have to applaud the jury awarding this the second prize, not this Agentic, but this the second prize, because as I've tried to explain, it was clear that they would give it to someone who played the game extremely well and played the cards very well. Bhatia, like many Indian architects, didn't play their cards that well. They didn't think they needed to, they didn't have to, they didn't have the expenses, they didn't have the money, they were in it for the, yes, for the game of architecture, but they were in it for the potential. And I think sadly, the potential didn't win out. And I think I would like to see some of the rewritings of modernism a little on this direction, rather than the language we use, some of the language you've seen here too, but, and this is no disrespect to Scriva and Srivastava at all, but our language is also changing in the way we can rethink these. But as Vibhuti has shown, we can rethink time and space if we look at other aspects. And then we can imagine what might have happened in that building had this type of project might have got an award. Next, your card.
And this is another famous play of Mandala, this time by B.V. Doshi, who's asked to design a new satellite township of Jaipur called Vidyadhar Nagar. And you can see again, similar to how Korea plays in plan. And this too is sort of exploring various configurations, the moon and the sun and the Vastu Purush and everything, laden with exotic stuff. The mandala. Your card.
Interesting. What Vibhuti's just said reminds me very much of this. We come back to the beginnings of modernism, or when, if we look at the work of John Haydock, who was one of these characters in modernism, which was taking it into another area in terms of space. He was never ever put in the postmodern camp, and he's an architect that has survived all these terms, partly because, but he began his work in Texas, teaching in the 1950s on 9 square grids. Of course, they called them grids, not mandalas in the architectural sense. And then you got Colin Rowe with Grid City, and the grid and the mandala, so the westernized version of the mandala and the grid. But it is very interesting. It would be very interesting history to go back to when the mandala or the gridded 9 square or 3x4 or 4x4 square became an operative tool within architecture. That would be interesting. But anyway, this is it at the end. It's a marvel of architecture. So said some. Others claimed that if Lerner didn't play the rules and was accepted not to play the rules, the competition should be rerun so that all architects could be allowed not to play the rules. Well, you can see how that argument can run and run. But postmodernism at the time, 1986, the pivot was a period when it was almost like, well, Rubik's Cube becomes the mandala in multidimensional. So there was the Rubik Cube game going on in architecture, as if you could go into positions and take positions. And I think it would be very interesting to see an Indian writer or an Indian historian taking on this decade, because I think it is a crucial decade between Indira Gandhi's influence spreading and then trying to flower into a huge memorial building, which was her idea, the Indira Gandhi National Center for Arts. And eventually that went over, and well, the history now of more sectarianism and isolationism is something that's happening, and that's another story now, which would be interesting to take into architecture. So yes, the interesting thing was the grid was there in many ways. The grid was there in Lerner's work, as it was in Luchans, whether it's vista, axis, grid, and less so in Bhattia's work, but more than in the third prizes, which were all basically technological solutions, which were a gridded architecture. Next one.
So this is the last slide. The Chhaja and Chowk, perhaps the most popular elements when it comes to describing pre-modern architecture, sort of ripped out of the form. And here are both represented, the Chhaja and the Chowk, but very much part of the architectural vocabulary.
I think that's the last card, and it is a card. So I'm playing on the literal. There is a literal card that you can play a game, and it shows James Stirling's Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, which was completed in 1984. The significance of it, and again, one of the things that would help very much to understand this IGNCA competition, you would have to understand the politics of friendship in India, and to understand the work that was going on in Princeton, Harvard, and Stirling was teaching, I think, at Harvard or Princeton, and Lerner coming out of Harvard. So it's inevitable that these ideas are spread, and you know, the politics of friendship is also a gaming situation. So we end there with our blind juxtaposition. You will notice that if this was a movie, the curtains on the previous slide would just close, because the curtains on the previous slide, and I just want to put that in an Indian context, because I bought those Mondrian curtains in the same year as this competition in 1986 from a market in Delhi, Lajpat Nagar, and they have lasted, what is it, 40 years. and all of them. So we close with Piet Mondrian closing the curtain, and we end with this next one, which which in a way is, we can map this in any way. We have a privilege of this when we have our own language, and we are sometimes in different parts of academia, but we also need to challenge the ways we see some of these things sometimes. And I hope here I've just done a quick, that's just a quick, and it can change with every project and every way, because in itself, that's a star radiating, but it could also be a mandala form where it's connecting. But the key to that project anyway, the IGNCA, was that Lerner played his cards really very, very well. Thank you. Thank you, Vibhuti.
Thank you.
Sorry, we've gone on a little long, but it's been very interesting.
Thank you, Roger and Vibhuti. I enjoyed that thoroughly, and I hope everyone did. But this play of cards and the way you had two parallel stories going on is so interesting, where, Vibhuti is talking about kind of an assimilated modernism. There is a negotiation that is going on with what is modern versus what is of a particular local context. I think is so interesting, versus what Roger is trying to put forth, that this mindless copying of certain elements that had existed in the Indian fabric brought forth with a new agenda. I think that juxtaposition really intrigues me. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to put it in the chat. But just to start this conversation, and definitely, Kurt, please feel free to add. But I really like the terms that you use, the idea of the diagrammatic approach versus a morphological approach, and how you brought forth what looks like a formal kit of parts, which is used for image making. I think those ideas, and while you were talking about these things, I was also reflecting partly on how we teach, right? All of us here are academics, practitioners in some capacity, but how can we probably be aware of this while we are teaching? And I know, it's a difficult question to answer, but what are some of your thoughts on how probably we are continuing this practice, even in terms of how we are teaching?
I think it's I think one of the things we can, it's a huge issue, but one of the things we can pay attention to is more attention to the language we are using, because we're all using the language. We're assuming it's shared, and that's why I took the sentences and gave them to Vibhuti from the book, Scriber's book, and chapter 6, because it was not a way to demean any of the critical writing in that section. It was just a way of showing, well, what if we move that language and we see it differently? And therefore we open our eyes, not necessarily that talk can change our lives. Maybe it can sometimes, but I think pedagogically, a deeper awareness of the language we use. I know it's a hard call, but I think it would be very, very important, because there are I think a lot of assumptions made in our curricula and syllabi through language.
Vibhuti?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think just to kind of make a counterpoint, I think we need to keep our eyes shut. And there is too much use of images in teaching architecture. There's slides, photographs, And we need to reflect on the language and to, to almost a cliched agenda now to decolonize it. Language is transformative. We all know that. And we have to be careful of the words we use to describe our cultures, our artifacts, our buildings, and be more mindful, aware of it.
I think that's a good point. And Pallavi, you will know, and this is this comes back. I remember Marco Frascari, Dr. Frascari, those of you who know, once challenged a teacher of history in architecture and said, "Could you just teach history this term without using images?" And the historian was appalled. The historian just went, "How can I possibly do that? It's in, you know," and Vibhuti's right, because the images are out there anyway. If it was possible, I tried to teach first years in the first month of their, and I said, I'm not going to show you images of buildings or architecture. I'm going to show you images of something that's going on, but I'm going to delay. And some students, again, in the first lecture would come after this, but this is an architecture course. How can you do that? And I said, patience, just wait. You're seeing you're surrounded by architecture. You're in buildings. You see plenty of them. Do you want more of them on the screen for me to tell you what they are? Or can you start moving around with? So I think Vibhuti's point is a really pertinent one. We could restructure some of our courses in a really healthy way.
Because I think when you teach architecture through these perfect pictures, it ruins the relationship you have with buildings or any possibility of a relationship you might have with the building, because it's bound to be disappointing once you've seen the perfect pictures. It's almost architectural pornography that we use to teach architectural history and architectural styles with. And I think that it is very damaging. I don't know what can replace it, but it is far from satisfactory, and especially when you're teaching design. It is a kind of it is going to be forever disappointing, because you're never going to have that perfect building. You're never going to have that perfect picture of your building. And also I think drawings do that as well, that, we are very quick to draw it. I think we should delay that drawing process and, make overlays and iterations and not have the final drawing, because the work of architecture begins when it's built. It doesn't end there. So the work of design actually really begins when the building is finished.
It's a very interesting point. And coming back to the competition, of course, I mentioned we're not privy to those that didn't come up, but I imagine I've been on a couple of architectural juries where somehow certain things make the choice simpler for the jury. And one of them is incompletion. Another one is that they don't obey the rules. And another one is that the elevations or the images requested are not there. And actually, I've been in Finland, where there's a little different approach to that, where the unfinished drawing, the drawing that's open, but allows you, and as Vibhuti said, allow you to imagine even the building process is not clear, demands a lot more on us, but in fact, it would probably be could be a more rewarding process. And you mentioned, I did want to say one thing about it. We have to be really careful about saying that this is mindless. or something is mindless. It is in a, we know we can do it against mindful and mindless, but a mindless imitation of things, very much, if one claims that Lerner's whole project was maybe mindless, it might be mindless in terms that it didn't go further in a layer of understanding motif. But clearly the work involved was extremely rigorous. And that's why he won. I wanted to make that very clear. And I think you can all see when you look at the drawings, and you can see if someone can do that sort of thing. Whether that is a game or not, that's something we can use and choose our language for that. But so I think we just have to be careful with, you know,
Yeah,
with our
in
own
fact,
language.
I don't think, yeah, you're absolutely right, I think, Roger, because I don't think anything is mindless.
No.
Anything may have agendas that we cannot understand and therefore think it is random.
Yeah.
But then there are subtle other power plays that come into operation that we don't probably agree with or do not endorse, but nothing is mindless.
And I think you've seen, and it's very interesting looking back at the images from Jaipur as well. This was a very complex moment in Indian history. Maybe 1996 was a complex moment in India. I don't know. I wasn't there, but the knowledge I have from that, it was really complex, and it was politically, it was complex. We haven't talked about that. Politically, it was the way decisions were made, the people, the divisions. This was all, you know, highly structured. There were agendas there, so we can't play down the whole political and social construct that's being created through that architectural competition.
But also, I think the case of Jaipur shows that there in every Maharaja's reign, there was a euphoric moment, probably led by technology or expansion of new city or, you know, new strategy. And it'll be quite interesting to sort of study what brings about this euphoria. And modernism in the 1950s was similarly, the Nehruvian period was full of euphoria and hope, and I think another wave came about in the 1980s with
Yes.
INCA, with Putul Jaika,
and the 1980s was extremely important, because if you take a writer like V.S. Naipaul, who became a commentator on India, even though he was Trinidadian and then British. But if you take Naipaul's journey, he started with what we might call the mindless, because India was called an area of darkness. Everything framed in the small book, his first book, is called An Area of Darkness. He could not cope with what he was seeing, like many Westerners. And he was from Trinidad. Then he went back, that's in the 50s, early. Then he went back, and the second book he wrote on India was called A Wounded Civilization. So he moved from the darkness to try and define the wound, what he read as a wound. But he went back and by 1985, what was his book? It was called India, A Million Mutinies Now. And when you look at the way he's written that book, he talks about listening. He went back and said, I'm listening now. And all his interviews in that book, A Million Mutinies Now, he's listening to different people, and he's transcribing it very well, but he's listening. It's less putting over the statements, and he does explore in the middle of that decade a notion that is perfect. I've always think, and he calls it joke knowledge, but it's not a joke. But he calls it because he was trying to explain why he had this journey. And he said, I had the joke knowledge of a young Trinidadian boy in school looking at red empire maps on the wall in the school and being taught how this empire rules the world, and every other country was a diagram to him. And he admits that. He said, I had no way of understanding. And I think that joke knowledge, we all have these diagrammatic, if you call it that, we all have these diagrammatic, we think we know some part of our knowledge in depth, and then the other is much weaker and more diagrammatic. And we tend to stray into the diagram and make comments about that area too. So it's a very interesting narrative. And I wonder if we have the same narrative in modernism. We go from darkness to wounded to mutinies now.
I think what Pallavi also commented on, that one of the key differences between the modernism that I show and the modernism you show is that there is a very strong element of lament in the modern modernism, whereas the Jaipur modernities are rooted in negotiation, rooted in pushing boundaries, and whereas in Naipaul and there in the post-war modernism, there is a strong element of the lost, the nostalgia for what is lost and left behind, and therefore there is a sadness attached to growth and development, because almost feeling guilty of developing and growing and becoming richer, and so there is a very, very clearly a very dark underside of all the kind of growth and development that is happening in after 1950s.
I think this is for another webinar, I'm sure. The notion of lament and nostalgia, how it shifts across not only a movement, because the lament and nostalgia in early modernism from the 20s was not there, but it was nostalgia for something else. And then the progress, and you're right, and then there's a lament, and suddenly you get modernism 1.0, 2.0, modernism 3.0, and lament. And I would be quite interested to know what lament and how you see lament or nostalgia from a historic period through photography, through the early photography, would be very interesting. But that's another dialogue.
There we go. We have another theme now for our next series. Always happens with you two. But just being mindful of the time, Kurt, would you like to add anything before I would like to ask Roger then to wrap up?
Sure, I have a question. In the spirit of, we've been talking about a lot of modernism here and some mindfulness, but I get the sense that, when we're talking about, these, aspects of history, that, in a way we are kind of reflective and looking back at, processes and assessing it from a particular point of view. And in a way we kind of apply a mindful critique to that in the way in which we approach, how we would look at particular events, how do we contextualize them, and how do we bring them forward. And some of these terms, like this idea of lament and things like that begin to emerge, in that investigation. Is there anything else in both of your investigation into these, historic events, you can maybe talk about the process, about how you went through it, or about the things that maybe were revealed, through that effort? Could you maybe talk a little bit about that from a quote unquote mindful reflection?
Roger, you want to go first?
I think that to take that up, I think it's always an aspect of a kind of self-contest, or you contest the self's position. you see what where I'm coming from on that? And that's not to make it so unsteady that you can't proceed through it, so that everything becomes either a bit blurry or every one term can place another, or you can develop your historical, because in a way we're talking about historiography rather than history. And we're talking about the mind in this way. If we use the word mindful, the alertness, and to come back to how you own it, I think, in terms of self, you're challenging the self as you speak and think. Does that make any sense? Kurt?
Yes, exactly. I think it has a lot to do with that sort of, positionality, or, some sort of, critical subjective,
because, yeah, the critical, because we could not have predicted what we were going to say. So in a way, we are feeding in that critical subjective within our process. There's a check on us, isn't there? In a way. I think that's how I think about it. Do you, Vibhuti?
And also, I think self-assertion is always, the foundation of it is on assumptions and biases, and our process was in a way to trip each other up with our own assumptions and biases. And I hadn't seen Roger's responses, and he hadn't seen mine, so I was surprised by some of his slides, and I think that is what is interesting, that, again, coming back to the language point, that a sentence can evoke, sentence about mindful modernism can evoke so many different kinds of responses that are, again, entrenched in deep biases and assumptions. I mean, mine and Roger's, and to be aware of those is what the point is, and to be aware of those, especially as designers and architects, you have to be super aware of all your assumptions and biases, because you're deciding for other people.
Yeah, and I think that's so you can build in unsteadiness without being deflected. You see what I'm saying? So I'm talking in a John Cage way. I think what we've just presented, we should just shuffle all the cards and the images and do it again in another way. And you'd have to rejoin it in another way. You could never repeat what you did. There's an element that we don't do that in teaching, because we tend to kind of fix it in time, or we have to fix it for a certain audience that is expected. But this is not to say that everything's random. It's that John Cage, the stochastic element of John Cage's work, where you can take something out of context and it unsteadies you, and then you readjust, and you have to. It's like music too. It's like his work.
I just want to also add there that that's why we had the S in brackets when we put in mindful modernisms, because of these multiple narratives that can and should exist, right? So that was the idea behind putting the S in parentheses. And because our conversation is also very much aligned to academics and how we teach, the pedagogical side of it, I think Kurt and I and Roger also want to emphasize some of the other follow-up activities that we are going to have, and the idea of mindful courses that we are launching soon. Anyone in the audience, if you are interested in joining our efforts, please email us. Kurt has put in our email IDs in the chat, so it'll be wonderful to hear from you and learn from you and see how we can take this forward collaboratively. I'm just mindful of the time, But it's been 2 hours and a few more minutes that we've been talking. It doesn't feel like that. I really enjoyed this. But Roger, may I ask you to say a few last words and then probably Vibhuti, if you want to add anything.
Okay. Thank you. I want to thank Vibhuti and thank you both, Pallavi and Kurt. I just want to say this: can our conversations change lives, change minds? Mindful and modernism are two highly loaded terms. What is openly challenged when colliding a word like mindful with modernism? How is it still relevant to contest modernism today without contesting the influence and even blindness of the movement as embedded and taught in schools and institutes? Perhaps this is the precise dilemma offered by such pairing, to be opened then in a series of multidisciplinary and intercultural dialogues and exchanges, what we here are calling mindful conversations and mindful modernisms. We shall end with the future. Do our ideas evolve? Do our conversations and dialogues move us forward? How relevant is our awareness of our own conversations? To close this first webinar on behalf of CCMH, I wish briefly to introduce E.H. Carr and the notion of history that has probably not been bettered from his set of lectures delivered in the 1960s called What is History? Known now as a classic, the very nature of rewarding a set of ideas as classic suggests they remain unchanging, and more, they stand in for what we might think today. We may be condemned to selectively find ways we think we are advancing or improving, but we might not be doing anything more than just fidgeting about with history itself, making fictions we pass off into an academic world. If so, we'd be wise to recall Nietzsche's line: when we are tired, we are attracted by ideas we conquered long ago. Was modernism conquered before we even realized it became modernism? We welcome everyone to the remaining 7 conversations in our series, information of which is available online. Thank you, Vibhuti, and on behalf of the curators, Pallavi, Kurt, and myself, we look forward to seeing you at our later shared presentations. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And on that note, Kurt, would you like to add anything? I saw you on mute.
No, I just want to say thank you to Roger and Vibhuti for a very interesting discussion and a great way to launch this new session. We're very excited about moving forward. We hope you all can attend the next sessions. Yeah, and I'll just allow Pallavi to close out the session for today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next Saturday with our conversation with Linda Ruth Salter and Anupama Kundu. It'll be at the same time on Saturday morning at 10 a.m. EST, which is 8:30 p.m. in India. So see you then. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.